or not even make an argument, just point out like an obvious fact for you, is that when communists in the past talked about women's rights, they were talking about women's rights to not be sold for a sack of potatoes. They were talking about women's rights not to have their genitals mutilated, not to be forced into being child wives, to have the right to get an education, to have a right to be able to become doctors and engineers and things that were previously closed off to them, to have the right to just be treated as a human being. And never has that ever been in question in the United States today. The feminists in America today, the closest thing they come to making this argument that women's rights are under attack is abortion. But abortion was criminalized in Stalin's Soviet Union, and it was also criminalized in almost every other communist state. So I guess they didn't believe in women's rights either. But even if you go beyond that and go beyond the surface, the idea that talking about basic differences between men and women, especially when we're talking about this in the context of personal relationships, and that somehow has a negative bearing on the communist legacy on women's rights, it just goes to show, I never like using this word, but it really is first world privilege. You think that when I say women cheating is not the same thing as men cheating, what does that have to do with women's rights? You don't have the right to be a fucking whore and not be called out for it. You don't have the fucking right to be a fucking retard flailing your arms around and not be called out for it. If you think people weren't fucking slut shamed in communist states, they were. It was considered indecent. I was told that how can you be a communist and make these talking points that sound like they're coming from the manosphere? I don't know, because communism is an inherently militant, revolutionary, and wow, masculine ideology. It is. It's the thing that makes people take up arms, as in their peaceful arms. I'm sorry, that's not an inherently feminine thing. If you think it is, you just don't know how fucking power works. Men are pretty much more likely to be warriors than women. That has been true for any period in history, literally any. There's never been a period in history where men were caretakers and stayed at home while the women went out and fought. Never, not a single point in history, not a single society ever in humanity had that arrangement. So if you're talking about a revolutionary ideology of any kind, that is going to be something masculine. Now, can women participate in it? Of course they can. But when you say things that hurt women's feelings, that is somehow an affront to women's rights. It just shows you how fucking uneducated you are. Women were classified as animals. They were literally classified as cattle. So when they were talking about women's rights, they weren't fucking saying that there's no difference between men and women and they're the same thing. All they were saying is that women are part of humanity. Mao said women hold up half the sky. Yeah, he's saying 50% of human beings are women, which is true. It's literally true. Was Mao saying that men and women should be treated the same way in every cultural respect? No, and they weren't. Even at the apex of the Cultural Revolution, that was not the case. Men and women were not treated exactly the same. Different norms and different expectations were expected of the different genders based on their behavior. And it was based on their gender, right? The behaviors of different genders were judged differently at every point in the history of communism. Every single point. Why? Because they don't mean the same thing, and they're not the same thing. In the October Revolution, there was a phenomena where women, young women, started to become more masculine. They wear leather shirts, and they start smoking cigarettes and hanging out with the boys. The head commission of health, or whatever, the health department in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, called this an unnatural phenomena that should be discouraged and corrected, because women were stepping out of anything close to being a feminine gender role and just fully becoming indistinguishable from men in these heavily urban places in the Soviet Union. So that's an example of how there's always been an acknowledgement that men and women are different. And the closest thing to the era of post-sex, or whatever you want to call it, post-genderism, was in the 1920s, in the avant-garde period in the Soviet Union. That kind of crazy trend sort of manifested itself organically, but the Soviet authorities reacted to it negatively. Stalin's Soviet Union. Peasant and worker were often gendered. Women were depicted as peasants who worked the fields, and men were depicted as industrial workers who worked in factories. And it's a very common motif in Soviet socialist realist art. And even in the Cultural Revolution in China, the idea that men and women became indistinguishable is also wrong. Because while they wore the Red Guards all wore the same uniform, the actual dynamics when it came to gender on the ground, when it came to relationships, did not function in an androgynous way that was indifferent to distinctions in gender. Even at the apex of the Cultural Revolution, Red Guard males would take on something. This is also not something very much accepted in Chinese culture at the time. Kind of like these girlfriends or whatever, Red Guard girlfriends or whatever. It was very gendered in terms of the relationship dynamic, like in the strict sense of not that they were treated as property, but like there was clearly a dominant role men exerted if you read the fucking literature. This idea that when you're talking about these basic differences between men and women, and that's somehow some kind of indictment on the communist history of, understanding the difference between men and women, it's like, you are full of shit. You don't know what you're fucking talking about.